We looked at the data, and it looks like more than half of the people who have graduate degrees have, on a Likert scale, relatively low trust in universities. So I think that's quite telling, is that even people who are going through our own universities are skeptical about what we do. And I think we have to confront this head on, especially if we're going to talk about threats to democracy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Leila Strong. I am the Newhouse Director of CIRCLE, which is the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, based here at Tufts University within Tisch College. With that, I'll let folks introduce themselves. So please take your time, talk about your institutions, your centers, and maybe a little bit about how do we meet this moment. With one person online, you know what, Jennifer, why don't we start with you?
So I'm Jen Murtazashvili. I am the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh, where I'm a professor in the School of Public and International Affairs. And I'm speaking to you from downtown Tel Aviv, where I thought it was a really good idea to bring my entire family, my husband and our 4 children, on sabbatical this semester. So we've just come out of a very difficult period. Hopefully tonight will be quiet and we can make it through this discussion together. But our center at the University of Pittsburgh, the Center for Governance and Markets, we really focus on voluntary cooperation. And I think that's what makes our center kind of distinct and different. We start from the premise that disagreement is not an obstacle to solving problems, it really is an asset. And so we study cooperation and trying to understand how that works under real conditions, under conditions of low trust, conflict, often scarce resources. We work not just in the United States, but in democracies, authoritarian regimes, in countries, fragile states. And we don't do this work from behind our desks. We work in the field. We work alongside communities and practitioners, and we study problem solving as it actually happens. So a lot of our international work has taken us to places like Afghanistan, Central Asia, Ukraine, Guatemala. And one of the things that we learned from our work in Ukraine is that decentralization, this is a really important political reform that took shape about 10 years ago, really reshaped how people relate to one another and to the state. And what that did is it created new opportunities for local problem solving and new forms of trust across communities. It's something we didn't expect to find. It also helped Ukrainians provide a really interesting bulwark of protection after the Russian full-scale invasion in 2022. We've just wrapped up a 3-year research project called Governing Deep Differences. So, Ibu, it speaks to a lot of the themes that you've just raised. We've studied how individuals and communities govern deep differences, traveling to some of the world's most divided societies, trying to understand how people navigate profound disagreement, not just survive it, but actually work together. And so what we're trying to do now is take these lessons home. We've always studied Rust Belt communities in and outside of Pittsburgh. We're based in Pittsburgh. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, so it's been a dream of mine to come home. And, Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania is one of the most politically and economically divided regions in the country. And we've just launched a new project called Pluralism 360. And it sees the solution to divisions on our campus in particular through prisms of shared problem solving, something that we've learned from our work across the world. So we teach civics and we believe in it, but our understanding of pluralism is really grounded in a harder question: under what conditions does cooperation emerge and under what conditions does it fail? We take religious pluralism seriously, and we work with organizations like Love Your Neighbor Network, exploring a concept of covenantal pluralism and what that looks like in practice. After October 7th, we launched something called the Compassion Project, which brought together students and faculty across religious divides to create space not to talk about global conflict, but just to talk about our shared humanity at a moment when it was very difficult. So all of our work is grounded in the work of Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom. That's really one of our North Stars and inspiration. And if you're not familiar with Eleanor's work, she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And one of the key insights that they shared is that people have tools to solve problems, but those tools are often easy for policymakers to overlook. So we bring to this work optimism, a real shared idea of creativity, and we're practical about it. So our hope is that when you hire a student from the University of Pittsburgh, you're hiring someone who can navigate hard challenges with deep respect for the people around them. And we really hope to continue building that in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I feel like we're going to get back to a lot of those topics, especially around divided societies. Mindy, do you want
First off, I just want to thank Peter and Leila and all the organizers of this event for inviting me here today. So I'm with the Price School of Public Policy at USC, and I run a research center called the Center for Inclusive Democracy. We've been around about 16 years. We actually started at UC Davis and moved over to USC about 8 years ago. And we're an applied research center. And I emphasize that because that'll tell you, right, the focus of our work really is external. It's about creating research that is actionable, about seeing change in the world. And our mission is pretty straightforward and small. It's just about informing, or actually, it's about seeing the improved quality of life in communities by informing the work of policymakers, as well as very much so on the ground efforts, community efforts, organizing efforts, all nonpartisan, but seeing that connection and the need for research that is trusted, that is independent, that is rigorous, in their work and in their public conversations, informing their work, and also in the public conversations that they have. So in the work that we do, we are a national research center, but we are very much focused on service in everything that we do. So that means that because we're based in California, maybe about half the work we do is dedicated to our home state. We think that's important. So we are conducting research in the democracy space, but we're very much known for work in the election space. So understanding patterns of participation, but also very much so representation, wanting to understand disparities, challenges, but also opportunities for change to see a fully, eventually representative and responsive and engaged democracy. And we think all of that is critical to actually always been needed, right, to see the full promise of our democracy, but also helps explain the vulnerability that we've seen, particularly in recent years, in our democracy. Happy to follow up on that. And so our work in working with policymakers and folks on the ground, we have a lot to show from that work. So we are cited in research. Our research is cited in dozens of legislative bills in California and outside of California throughout the country. We make sure that we connect with policymakers. We try to, in every way, shape, and form, produce research that is digestible, easy to understand. Yes, it's a large research report, but there's also a two-pager, right? There's an explainer. There is the invitation and the established relationship over time to discuss that work, to bring that work to the attention, right, of the policymaker, and a trust in the work and a trust in that relationship over time. You can't just produce the work; you have to make sure it's digestible, and you have to have that relationship, and be able to sincerely and effectively communicate that work. For on the ground efforts, community organizing efforts, community-led efforts, statewide advocacy efforts, we are completely nonpartisan. But again, in of service, we will go wherever we are called. We will answer questions. We will disseminate our research, and we actively, aggressively disseminate our research through our networks, and through media and through other audiences and other partners. And in that dissemination, it doesn't really work also unless you are trusted by those other audiences, right? Community groups have to know who you are, why you're even doing this sort of work, what your goals are, what your potential motives, right, or incentives are. And over time, we have built that trust, particularly in our home state, but beyond our home state as well. And it matters who the researchers are that are doing the work. I used to think when I first started, I couldn't put my name on something. It was about the center. It was, I know it was. Anyway, and I quickly realized that the first thing people needed to know, especially in the community side of things, was who I was, right? Could I be trusted? What were my motivations? What were my incentives? Or maybe I had good incentives, but as noted earlier, right? So much of the researcher community history has been one of extraction. Even good intentioned efforts can cause and have caused lots of damage. And so not just that you're good intention and what your motivations are, but that you're going to actually act responsibly and build a track record, right, of responsibility, and that you're going to be around, whether there's a grant or not, and that you're in it for the long haul, that this really is your mission, right, to do this work. So I wanted to emphasize that up front. I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but that's really key to who we are as a center in service, thinking the long term, building those relationships, being deeply committed to the nonpartisan work, but work that actually will create actionable change and see ultimately a responsive, engaged, representative democracy. So I'll stop there.
Amy?
Hello, everybody. I am chastened by the ideal vision that Ibu put forward for what civic thought or democracy centers might be, because I'm going to talk very nuts and bolts about what ours is without some of the gorgeousness around the picture that you drew. My name is Amy Binder, and I am a sociologist at Johns Hopkins, also appointed in the SNF-Agora Institute. And as a researcher, you talked about, naming who you are on your reports. I just want to report that I study culture and politics and higher education and organizations, mostly in school settings. And I have a specific focus on student activism on the left and on the right, but I've extended some of the studies that I've done on students to other folks who inhabit universities, like libertarian academics who find themselves in universities and have strong feelings about being there. I joined SNF-Agora in 2023. I spent most of my career at Bona's institution of UC San Diego. It was hard to leave paradise for Baltimore. I ended up loving Baltimore. I just want to make that clear. But I felt a magnet pull from the West Coast to Johns Hopkins because SNF-Agora is really a great intellectual home for me. And what Agora does is it brings an interdisciplinary group of faculty. There are now 15 of us total. There are another number of us to join in future years. We're only 6 years old, so it's been meteoric growth in just 6 years. And we represent political science, history, sociology, public health, international studies. I'm probably forgetting a couple. And these are all tenure track positions. So we're all appointed both at Agora and in academic departments. And then we're joined by faculty and continuing fellows, including folks like the journalist Anne Applebaum. Nothing like Anne to make you feel incredibly unproductive in your academic career. Yasha Monk, Peter Pomerantsev, Scott Warren. We also have a number of visiting fellows per year, so up to 11 or 12. These are practitioners to be distinguished from academics. They do things in the world. They include artists in residence, dissidents in residence, think tank fellows like Jenna Story, and nonprofit leaders and so on. And they are really important for telling us what's happening in the real world and connect with academics so that we can do greater things together. And we also educate a lot of students. So undergrads, grads, pre-doctoral fellows, postdoctoral fellows, and we're trying to train students what it means to do not only their academic work, but also democracy work. It helps to be endowed with $150 million to accomplish all of this work. That's been an incredible gift. And what binds us together is a commitment to studying democracy and democratic backsliding in the US and around the world, and trying to strengthen democratic processes and norms and practices. What's distinctive about SNF-Agora is we're trying to do a lot of things at once. In addition to all of these constituencies, we also have a lot of projects. So one of the projects is to do excellent academic research. And that's great. That makes us like a consortium of academic departments. But each of us has our own research projects. Our inaugural director, Hari Han, studies movement organizing. My colleague, Lily Mason, studies political polarization and political violence. Historians, Leah Wright studies Black representation in Congress. So we're all doing our own projects, which creates some challenges, which is how can we be greater than the sum of our parts, you know? So that's something I'd like to discuss later if it's of interest to folks. And then we call that pillar discovery. So research is discovery. And then our second pillar is dialogue. What makes us distinctive is that we're trying to bring in research and dialogue at the same time. So this is conversations across difference. A lot of people are familiar with these kinds of programs. Ours range from formal debates, student debates, smaller workshops, all kinds of big tentpole events. And then the third D is what we call design. So this is trying to harness the academic research to doing things in the world, not only with the practitioners in our midst, who are the visiting fellows, but also people nationally, regionally, internationally, to involve them in our research and our other projects, and to develop civic partnerships with folks who aren't necessarily always represented well in the university. So we're trying to do a lot of things, some of them in fits and starts, some of them more successful currently than others. And I really appreciate being here and learning from other folks what they're doing. So I can bring that back home.
Thank you. Thank you to Peter and Layla and the rest of the team for organizing all of this. I know a lot goes into the logistics, so we're all really, really grateful. I'm Jessica. I'm the Director of Research at the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. We are a pan-university institute, nonpartisan, and we are about 5 years old, and we emerged out of an initiative that had begun in the College of Arts and Sciences, which was called the Democracy Initiative, and then we became the Karsh Institute. Some of that Democracy Initiative work has continued on with us, and some new work has started as part of the Karsh Institute. I was talking earlier to my co-panelists here, when the Democracy Initiative started in about 2018, 2019, Melody Barnes, who's the executive director of the Karsh Institute, and I started around then. And I remember telling people we were working on democracy, and we kind of got the like, oh, that's nice response. And now when we say we're working in the democracy space, it feels a bit more different. And so just Layla, to your point about the context and how we meet this moment, the moment has changed since 2018. So our work is, I think we can largely divide it into kind of two main branches. We have programming activities. So we do a lot of public facing work. We have a big Democracy 360 convening. That's a 3-day convening where we bring in boldface names, and we work with The Atlantic as our media partner and Virginia Public Media to stream the convening. And we have a Congress series where we bring in former and current members of Congress to talk about Congress as an institution and the ways in which it may be working or not in this particular moment. So we brought in Senator John Cornyn, Chip Roy, then former Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, who's now the governor in Virginia. We just hosted Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi. So these kinds of convenings are meant to encourage civic dialogue. They're meant to surface interesting ideas and conversations. But part of what they are also meant to do is to model civic dialogue among people who disagree. And so we take that kind of role seriously about the modeling that helps to shape civic behavior. We also support a Civic Cornerstone Fellowship, which is a student dialogue program. It's grounded in, we have a faculty partner, and it's grounded in that faculty's research. She does research on deliberative dialogue. And so that has shaped this program. We've served about 1,000 students so far. We've have representation from every school across the university, from the medical school and architecture school to the arts and sciences. And that seems to have been a really important program for students in terms of a co-curricular activity. And they talk about politics. So we are just going into some of the key issues that they're wrestling with. And again, research is part of this. So the faculty member that has helped to shape this program is also doing qualitative research alongside this program to understand the student experience for her own academic research. And so that's sort of our programming space. And we have practitioner fellows and those we work with outside of the university. In the research space, we have a couple different types of activity, and we are leaning towards applied research, translational research, to be a place within the university that isn't doing the exact same things as schools and the departments, but doing something a little bit different, or at least trying to leverage expertise that exists in departments and schools and apply them to public issues and public problems. So we have long had what we call democracy labs. This started early on in the Democracy Initiative. We've had labs on anti-corruption, and it turned out this happened during COVID. And so faculty members who had expertise in India and Pakistan and Brazil couldn't do their field research. And so they focused on the PPP program that was offered by our government. And they found really interesting things in terms of, small rule changes tended to reduce fraud by hundreds of millions of dollars. And so these kinds of findings, we shared with members, we shared with folks on the Hill, and of course have it in our back pocket in case the next kind of emergency spending moment reappears. So doing that kind of work, currently we have Digital Technology for Democracy Lab that, again, these are kind of interdisciplinary, faculty-led laboratories of democracy. They're faculty, postdoctoral researchers, undergrads, graduate students. And this particular lab has faculty from computer science, data science, architecture, sociology, media studies. And so it's a real range of expertise and approaches. And there's 11 postdocs as part of this lab. So there's a lot of really rich work being done on kind of like the digital challenge that we face at this moment in democracy. We have Democracy and Capitalism Lab, again, to kind of address issues at the intersection between those big categories of activity and thought. We have a History and Principles of Democracy Lab, so to bring political thought and history and philosophy to the fore in this kind of work. And then finally, just again, to kind of address your point about meeting the moment, we start to establish initiatives in response to political context. So we are at the moment leaning towards state and local research, so trying to work a bit more in that space. We've done some work already to date. So a few examples of that. We just finished last year a local news ecosystem assessment of the local journalism landscape in Virginia, with the idea that journalism and democracy are importantly connected, and especially local journalism and democracy. And so that research ended up being cited in an application for a Press Forward chapter in Virginia, a successful application. So now Virginia has a Press Forward chapter, in part due to some of the research activity that helped to support that. We also are trying to aid when we can, when the Commonwealth of Virginia has questions before them and they don't have the resources and the capacity to have the information that they need to make good decisions. So we put together a faculty collaboration around a question that the Commonwealth is considering. They recently formed a Virginia Election Commission to address whether Virginia should consolidate its elections. So Virginians vote every year, and state and local are on different cycles or state and local are on one cycle and the federal election is on another. And so the question is, if we consolidate, would we have better turnout? Will we have better representation? So these kinds of questions. And in order to answer them, we drew on the resources that exist at the university and brought in faculty who could actually start to address these questions. We looked at legal context and so forth. So trying to amass and marshal the resources of the university towards these kinds of public questions. And then finally, we have a center that is part of the Karsh Institute called the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service. And this center has a long history of working in Virginia politics and government, addressing research questions. So there's a survey research center, there's a demographic research center, and there's an economic trends analysis center. And so when Virginia experienced a lot of the federal job losses, the Economic Trend Analysis Center was really working overtime to sort of address what kind of impact that would have. And so that a lot of that work informs public policy decisions. So the forecasting on demographics helps school districts predict their tax base and populations and all of that. So there's a way in which we're doing very public-facing programming that's meant to model civic dialogue, but also doing a lot of research advancement in the translational space to connect with pressing public issues.
Wow. I mean, really incredible work. And it's interesting how diverse your approach is in each of these institutions and the capacity for how you're teaching and educating around democracy, as well as incorporating kind of a pluralistic ideology. And I think, Amy and Jessica, you mentioned kind of democratic backsliding. So I'm curious, we are in a moment of intense focus on democratic backsliding, but also on democratic innovation. What is the single most important role a university-based democracy center can play right now that a traditional academic department cannot?
Well, I think that there are ways in which we can help to kind of bend incentive structures to give people the space and even sort of the justifications to their own departments and schools as to why they can spend precious time and resources to address precisely those kinds of questions. I think maybe I'll just give an example. So one of the ways in which perhaps this has been helpful. We have worked with a few faculty members in the politics department to do a survey last year, a national election survey in 2024. That required getting a grant, that required an infrastructure to support. And I don't know if the faculty members would have been able to secure the resources and the time to be able to do this work without sort of some help from the Institute. And I think what the work has showed is, and I was talking to my table mates about this earlier, that it was a national survey of registered voters. And they surveyed voters, the same panels before and after the election. And they found that vast majorities of those who identified as Democratic and Republican overwhelmingly had positive experiences voting at the polls. They thought their poll workers were competent, their polling place was well run, they didn't really have to wait in line, they understood the process, they thought their vote counted as they intended. And likewise, for those who used mail-in ballots, felt really confident about that process, thought their vote was intended, or thought their vote was counted as intended, felt like there were secure protections around fraud. So we help to kind of capture that experience. And I think that helps in a way to be able to counteract some of the narratives around distrust in elections or election integrity, that the experience that people are having across parties is overwhelmingly positive. Now, the caveat there is that their personal experiences didn't always shape their perception about what was happening outside of their state. So nationwide, there were some doubts on the part of some people about whether there was fraud more broadly. So there is a way in which I think as an institute, we can help to sort of do the research that helps to showcase some of these issues so that those entities and organizations that can intervene in these spaces have the information that would be helpful for those interventions.
So anybody else have thoughts? Yeah, please.
Sure. So I'm excuse me, I'm thinking about this a little more institutionally. I really appreciate the outreach to larger constituencies. But I'm struck in my in the move from being in an academic department to being in a democracy center by how much work it is to be in a democracy center. So especially when you have multifaceted things that you're trying to do, which is again the three pillars of discovery, design, and dialogue. And academic departments don't expect you to do the dialogue and the design, and they may even frown upon it, right? If it takes away from the core academic work that you're supposed to be doing. So, we're set up differently. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is to be a bridge institutionally. It sounds like Karsh is doing things really, really well. I think some of the things that you're doing are things that we're aspiring to do. We really want to be a go-to place for folks who have questions about democracy. We have this big endowment. We have a beautiful new building built by Renzo Piano that someday we're going to move into. It's been delayed a million different times, but we should live up to our reputation. But as I was kind of alluding to before, it's difficult when one of your primary identities is as a research place where different people, different cats do different kinds of research who then would need to be herded by somebody to be more than the sum of the parts. So one of the things that we are trying to do, and Leila, I don't know if this really addresses your question about what are we doing to meet the moment. But again, institutionally, one of the things that we're trying to do is learn more about ourselves right now. So like any unit, academic unit, we've brought in outsiders to tell us about what they do, and we've lost track of what we do. So this last year, in terms of our seminars, we're talking about what we do academically, but also what we do to try to reach outside folks. So people who are doing podcasts know something that those of us who are not doing podcasts know. People who have newsletters are doing something that the rest of us don't know. We don't even really know about each other's research. So how are we going to collaborate and be the place where outsiders will come for information about how to do things? So we're looking internally to be able to be better external partners at some later date.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could just jump in very briefly.
Please.
So, we really believe that we can tackle this moment by modeling it ourselves. And one of the things that I think that gives me great pause personally, I won't speak for everyone at our center, is that, if we look across the board, that trust in universities has really taken a nosedive across the country, across almost every single demographic. And in fact, I was doing a presentation on this issue of trust in higher ed at our annual teaching conference, and someone raised their hand and said, well, the people who have lost trust in universities are those who have never attended them. And we looked at the data, and it looks like more than half of the people who have graduate degrees have on a Likert scale, relatively low trust in universities. So I think that's quite telling, is that even people who are going through our own universities are skeptical about what we do. And I think we have to confront this head on, especially if we're going to talk about threats to democracy. Because we work comparatively and domestically, I worry about some of the language about democracy and democratic backsliding as it applies to the United States, because I find it's often applied in a very partisan way. And I see this among our students, that when someone doesn't like something that someone else does, it's called, that person is no longer democratic. And I worry about that language quite a lot. We have to be very intentional in how we use that language and how we model things. What we've tried to do at our center, and we are now the largest research center in the humanities and the social sciences at the University of Pittsburgh, and we're entirely soft funded. So that means that we have cultivated a community ourselves, and we have a lot of independence in the work that we're able to do. However, it does limit kind of the institutional, influence that we can have on things like curriculum because we are completely soft funded. But one of the things that we've tried to do is use philanthropy to bridge divides. We try to get philanthropists from across the political spectrum. I don't like to think of them as political, but who have different priorities, and get them to invest in our work, because we believe that by doing that, we model to the rest of the university that, number one, this is possible, but number two, if we're going to talk about pluralism and bridging divides, we actually have to show respect to everyone. And so, how we use our language, we're very, very intentional about that, and that we focus on something positive, which is shared problem solving, that we can, teaching in a public policy school, some of the language that I hear, it's not just my school, but a lot of schools like ours. We talk about, training the next generation of change makers. And, this is something that we see at our national associations, for example. And I find this language actually to be, some of the things that contribute to our polarization, that we're supposed to be, teaching students who are embarking on careers in the public service. And we believe that they should be stewards of the public trust rather than instigators of it. And what do I mean by that? If you look at curricula at programs like mine, over the past 20 years, the nature of the curriculum has really shifted to expertise on policy issues and kind of wonkiness to a focus on things like advocacy and how to have influence, and things that often look like activism. I wouldn't always call it that because this is civil society work. But if we look at how the curriculum has broken down, it's overwhelmingly focused on things like that, and no longer focused on the boring things. The things are not sexy, like health policy reform, regulatory reform, some of the things that are so very important to make our democracy work. Yet, we're all so focused on scrolling on our phones, and we want instant change. And, none of us have really talked about the influence of social media and the expectations that that puts on democracy and civic life. And one of the things that obviously does is create instant, pressure to create things and have an influence instantaneously. Whereas I think we would all agree that the work of democracy is slow, and it's deliberative, and it's slogging. And how do we model that, right? When our students are, scrolling on their phones and they want change now, and when that's reinforced with a curriculum that, really encourages them to make demands now. How do we go from that model of advocacy, which is obviously very important, however, I don't think should be necessarily the crux of a curriculum. The curriculum should focus on things that we see emerging in more traditional civic programs, but also on specialization, specialization in specific policy sectors, expertise. We all talk about the death of expertise and how experts are no longer respected as much as they once were. How do we develop that expertise, real policy expertise among our students? So one of the things we try to do, for example, we have an entire pillar on the governance of emerging technologies. So we have students working with engineers, with computer scientists to really understand those issues specifically. And what we bring to the table is the governance perspective, but really focusing on the self-governing aspects of those things. What are the threats of these technologies, for example, to democracy and so forth? So, I would just be very careful. We really have to model that. If we're concerned about the health of democracy as faculty, as university leaders, as administrators, we are the ones that have to show that we are good stewards of the public trust.
It's interesting because I keep hearing everyone mention trust building, being stewards of the public good, public trust, in this time of an expectation of immediacy via social media, and in a time of skepticism. I think I'll turn it back to the group and ask, a common critique, though, is that research on democracy is often consumed by people who are already committed to it. So how do we shift that aperture? How do we create and design research projects, strategies that kind of expand both to academics, to students, but across the broader community? Please, Mindy.
I'll jump in. Well, I think first you have to do it with communities and with a broad spectrum, right, of perspectives, voices, placement. You know, at least certainly from a research center standpoint, one of the big differences, obviously, is that usually research centers are, at least to some degree, external to the university, and we have different incentive structures, but then academic departments certainly. But we also are established usually with a mission, right, to achieve a certain set of goals that are often right somewhere along the line, right, about if we're a democracy center, improving democracy, improving engagement, improving the bottom line in communities. So because of that, if you think about it, why would we do research that is totally within the ivory tower? Ooh, dare I use that phrase today? I know. And, you know, at least for my center, we are certainly still, you know, publishing in journals and thinking about academic literature and advancing conversations and dialogue and discourse within the academy. But first and foremost, and I do emphasize this, I think proudly, I mean, the research questions that we are choosing to explore are informed by what our mission tells us they should be informed by. So we listen to policymakers. We also, by the way, think this is a great way not to kind of start going down the bias path, if you will, because as long as you're listening to a broad spectrum of people, right, and perspectives, then you're hearing the needs, requests around research, right? That's broad. So we do that with policymakers, and we very much do that with community groups, whether it's the League of Women Voters to Common Cause to the Black Freedom Fund to whatever the group might be. You have to establish those relationships, like I mentioned earlier, right? I think across the board, no matter what type of center you are, if you're doing this kind of work. So you're really hearing the true needs and you really are working in partnership and do not check a box. Right, because communities know that. So we've established, and I think I would, you know, I would urge this for others as well, to have longstanding advisory committees, right, where you're bringing in different perspectives. It's not just around one grant. It might also be around one particular grant that you're working more closely with. The research itself is always independently conducted. The findings are the findings. So sometimes people are not, or certain groups versus others may not be so happy with what the findings are to those research questions, but you stay steadfast. And over time, there is respect and not only respect and appreciation, but incredible value that is seen by multiple groups across, right, different perspectives in that steadfastness, right? We know we're not always going to like the findings, but we know we can trust them. We know they don't go with the wind. We know we'll find something that is helpful and useful, or at least we understand, right, what the data is that's out there, even if we don't necessarily find it useful for what we're working on at the moment. And that can be an elected official, that can be an advocacy group, that can be a community, civic council, whatever it might be. So, so that's, I think, sincerity long-term in terms of that engagement, doing it in collaboration. I still argue that the research itself should be independent, but when you have those findings, wherever possible, it's not always possible, but taking it back to that advisory committee or back to the community to make sure also that you're understanding, right, or at least getting their perspective on what those findings are. And that's back to being just responsible researchers, I believe. When you're doing any sort of work that's going to be impacting the public good, you want to know that you understand what the consequences might be from that research. Doesn't change the findings, but you should be aware of how you write it up, how you discuss it publicly, what the dialogues are, that you're using the right language that is responsible as well. And I think I'm answering your question in there.
Absolutely.
So I'll move it on.
But I see Amy is also nodding her head, and I would imagine from a sociological perspective, you have additional thoughts.
Sociologist rule.
And I'm a sociologist,
There you
political
go.
sociologist. There you
Okay.
go.
There's your proof of concept. So the question is, how to reach people who are disengaged or skeptical, right?
Especially now in this time of
Especially now.
desired immediacy.
Yeah, I would say that this goes back a ways as well. I've been studying conservatives for about 20 years, specifically conservative college students. And it was really important when I started my research to not assume that these folks were disengaged or complacent or resistant. I started from the idea that people are skeptical about certain kinds of discourses because they feel like institutions have not lived up to their promise or have failed them. And, I think when we're talking about our centers, the question is not how can we get our expertise across better so that people can finally hear the truth. It's more about like meeting people in their own inhabited lives. So that's the way I tried to approach my research. And I just want to say just a little tiny bit about it and some of the responses that I got to it 20 years ago when I started studying conservative college students. So around 2005, I decided I was really interested in hearing about the lives of people who identify on the right in college. There was a lot of talk about various sorts of challenges that they faced, but I felt like nobody had done a recent study of what their lives were really like. So I wanted to do this qualitatively. When I began this research, I actually faced a lot of skepticism from people about why I would want to learn about the lives of right-leaning students. And I even talked with one history professor at a fellowship I was at who was studying Nazis. And he likened the conservative college students that I was studying to the people that he was studying. And I was like, that's a stretch. And so there was some hurdles that I had to get across. And also at the time when I was doing this research, there were very few people studying conservatism generally in the social sciences. We've really come a long way since then. Everybody and their mother is now studying this, and it's really important to do so from a bunch of different points of entry with different kinds of people. So I really wanted to understand students' understandings of being educated in institutions that do lean left, what that meant for their involvement in clubs, what that meant for their styles of expression, what that meant about their feelings of being in the swim of things or not. And then when it comes to dissemination, that work was covered quite a bit in the media. I think if I were to be at Agora when I was doing that project, I would conduct myself very differently and disseminate very differently rather than waiting for people to come to me to interview about what I learned. I would be out there more on the hustings, getting my findings out there, in accordance with what's important to this institution. And I've also really tried to use the research that I did with students to be much more sensitized to the experiences of other folks in the academy who do not toe the line of many of the progressive politics of their colleagues. And that's made me really interested in intellectual diversity and ideological diversity. And I have different kinds of partnerships with different kinds of people, and I'm involved in different kinds of projects because I had done that research a while ago. I just want to put in a plug for one other person at Agora who's doing really fascinating work. This is a fellow named Scott Warren, who has been traversing the United States in red and purple states, talking with Republican officials, election officials, civil society folks about how, and all of the folks that he's talking with do not believe that the 2020 election was stolen, which means that they're swimming upstream in the party. But his feeling is that to help develop a pro-democracy conservative agenda, it's to get people in the room who agree on some basic precepts and who can support each other during election time. And he coordinated with R Street, which is a conservative think tank. So they're really walking the walk and not just talking the talk. in what we're talking about here today.
I love the idea of ideologically and physically meeting people where they're at. I think this is an incredible step forward in our capacity to do research across this field and space. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions. I see folks are already queuing. Please.
Hi, my name is Darcy Daniels. I am a high school history teacher. I teach in Mendon-Upton Regional School District, and I teach US 1, US 2, and AP Government. And my question has to do with the fact that I teach all students. I teach them whether or not they're going to be going to Ivy League schools or whether or not they're going to be going into the military or trade schools. And so I'm wondering if you work with public schools or if you work with your education departments, if your education departments have teacher training programs, and if those teacher training programs teach how to teach civics, right? Because how are we going to, if the goal is for us to have a electorate that is, feels seen, heard, and valued, if not everyone goes to college, where are they getting that information from?
So at the University of Virginia, K through 12 teacher training is taken very seriously, and there's a lot of work that's happening in that space. We are one of many entities that are in a little bit in that space. So this past year, we had a group of educator fellows for democracy, and they were K through 12 teachers from the Charlottesville and Albemarle County area. And from some were in elementary schools, middle school, high school. So they had a range of students and sort of frameworks in mind that they would use for those different students. So what we had thought to do was to, especially in light of the 250th and all of the conversations about U.S. history and how we think about that, we brought two of our, we have Gibson Fellows in American History right now, and they're terrific, Iris DeRode and Lauren Duvall, in case anyone knows their work. And Lauren led that Teacher Fellows program. So part of the work was her talking about her knowledge and sharing her knowledge about her area of expertise, which is on women in the American Revolution and households. She has a really great book with a clever title called The Home Front in the Revolutionary War. And it was to co-design this program for the year. So the teachers, there was a lead teacher from one of the elementary schools who was working with Lauren to co-design this program for the year. So the program involved both them thinking about how they would implement the Educating for American Democracy initiative. And so thinking about modules, giving them the time and space to do that. And also they were invited to engage with faculty that we work with. They worked with our faculty member who's involved in our dialogue work. They worked with other experts in American history. Lauren brought in educators from museums to talk with the fellows, and then they attended a lot of our public events. So we have a couple, we have an event series called Touchstones of Democracy that Josh has been in, where we highlight important faculty work around questions in the history and principles of democracy. So the program was co-created. It was meant to give them some space to design modules using materials that had been developed by other experts, but with their sort of lens on what would be useful in their spaces and according to the level at which they were teaching. So again, just giving them the space to do that. There's other initiatives. So our Democracy and Capitalism Lab runs a teacher institute on that over the summers, and it's well attended, and they are doing that again this year. So there's a couple different ways in which we've done that, and I think, as in other places, we're trying to bridge kind of expertise through a co-created program that will benefit teachers in the ways that they might need it in their classroom.
I want to go back to models of civic dialogue. And the reason why I'm asking it is because I was a selectman for a number of years, and I was not born in a town. And so I had to learn a lot about how to be a selectman when I was elected. Mm-hmm. And I had to learn how town meeting functioned. And what I realized is that people who were moving into towns didn't understand how town meeting functioned. So I started a series on teaching folks parliamentary procedure, Robert's Rule of Order, because the people who did know how it worked knew how to weaponize those tools. So I'm curious, in your current way of thinking about encouraging civic dialogue, what kind of tools are you using? Because those tools have been around forever, Robert's Rules of Order. Young people now, when they look at it and they see how Congress is functioning or dysfunctioning, they can see these things as weaponized, not as ways to get things done, but to interfere with progress. And I just want to also just quickly mention that one of the amazing things about the pandemic and the use of Zoom that I saw was a much more dynamic, exciting, less patriarchal, less controlled way of encouraging dialogue on Zoom with emojis and hand raising and all kinds of dialogue in the chat. And in some ways, I'm missing that because we've now kind of defaulted to these more traditional ways of engaging in dialogue.
Yeah.
So what kind of new tools are you seeing and what are you encouraging? And could you see the dismantling in the future of these old tools and having them replaced with new and exciting things?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Jennifer, I see you nodding your head vigorously. Would you like to take this one? As a senator?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to this, specific example, but one of the things that we've really noticed is sort of how do I say this, a de-NGOification of civil society. So, and we see this both domestically and globally, that for a long time, many local organizations, started off as grassroots civic organizations. They became very effective in their work, and then eventually took federal funding or state funding. They became social service providers. And what this did, although very well intentioned, was an effort, to drive public policy down to the grassroots level. It really shifted what, we call in economics the principal agent problem. So the principal then became the government, and then the organizations are sort of acting on behalf of that key stakeholder who's providing much of the funding. I've seen this actually quite a lot in our community work in Pittsburgh with refugee support organizations that have faced a lot of cutbacks in the past year, who started off, very much as grassroots community organizations, and then we're so focused on, implementing federal funding. Now, why is this an answer to your question? Because I think there's a lot of creativity taking place right now in communities. And that's why I just really want to push back on the backsliding narrative, the democracy is dying narrative. I see a lot of incredible creativity that's happening both in person and in online spaces. And those are things that I think we don't study quite enough. We study activism, but we don't study problem solving. And I think these are things that deserve a little more of our attention. And they are civil society that are, that are truly grassroots, that are not, funded by external actors in many cases. And, in response to, strong executive power that we've seen in the United States over the course of several generations, we've seen, I think, in many communities, a revitalization of civic life. People very animated and excited to participate in local elections. We've seen record numbers of women, right, running for elections, especially at the local level. So I think there's a lot for us to understand how rules at the top may affect, to your point, the administrative procedure. I should, tell you as a faculty member, we see Robert's Rule of Orders abused so often. Someone's in the middle of the debate, and of course, someone wants to make a motion and end discussion. It always comes as a shock because I guess many of us never think to use the rules those ways. But this is I think it's a ubiquitous issue, even for those who are very well versed in those rules. So just to keep your eye out for the creative ways that people are coming together, and when they identify issues in their communities, how are they responding? And I think this is such an important aspect of democracy that really, gets overlooked. At, for example, the United States has a federal system, and without robust civil society and associational life, Can we sustain a federal system? That's what really worries me, is the associational life we have as a republic. And that goes beyond, the formal rules and procedures, but really about how we treat ourselves, how we treat our neighbors, how we work with one another. And there's a lot to be concerned about, even within those realms. But I do think that there's a lot that we can learn from and take encouragement from.
Thank you. And as we all step forward into learning, I think we are at time. Thank you all so very much for joining me.